Hello everyone and welcome to this month's TELedvisors webinar. I'm Colin Simpson from the TELedvisors group. Today we're going to be joined by Dr. Iwona Czaplinski talking about learning networks, active learning and all things in between. Just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just by way of introduction, Dr. Iwona Czaplinski is an educational researcher investigating learning task design within the technology-rich environment to promote student active learning. Prior to finishing her PhD, Iwona completed a Master of Arts in Linguistics, specialising in teaching foreign languages. Then she moved on to an MPhil and looked at synchronous and asynchronous online interactions between domestic learners of French and native speakers. In her PhD, titled An Analysis of Learning Networks of STEM Undergraduate Students to Promote Active Learning, Iwona looked at the ways that students were using their formal and informal learning networks to actively learn. Her thesis was nominated for the Outstanding Doctoral Thesis Award by one of her external examiners. So I'll hand it over now to Iwona.
Thank you very much, Colin. Thank you very much for introduction, and big thank you to everyone for coming and spending this 1 hour. I hope you will find the presentation interesting. Let me know if you have any problems with hearing me or any technical difficulties, and I will make sure that at the end of the presentation there will be plenty of time for discussion. Hopefully you'll be interested in my ideas. So because I don't have much time, as always in such situations, I prefer to start with the short summary about my research, and today I'm promoting a little bit and talking about the PhD. So the focus of my PhD basically was on the questions related to educational design and to the value of network learning practices and the understanding of learning activities within an ecological framework. And this ecological framework was very important for me because I do see the learning activities, like any other, activities in life, as a constant dialogue, constant interrelationship with ecology and the environment and the individual. So this work stemmed from the need which I perceived, and I still think there is a big need to investigate how to help students in this context that was first-year university students to become autonomous, especially epistemically fluent lifelong learners who are capable of tackling complex problems. And I'm thinking here about complex problems, but also wicked problems. The challenge, this is the high-level goals, and this kind of goals, they really require very careful reconstruction and redesign at the course curriculum and learning environment level. So it's not an easy task. I think that the two major contributions made by the work, the first is the demonstrate clearly how wide is the gulf between the aspects of the learning design, our practical existing practice, and also the progress of students in becoming autonomous lifelong learners. So that's one of the problems. And the second major contribution of my work is to demonstrate how a well-theorized analysis of learning arrangement provide vital information for educational redesign. And I will stress this importance of the theory because, theory is there to describe the reality. And I do believe that we need to strongly underpin our research with a theoretical aspect and then nicely use them for a discussion and interpretation of this, what we have observed. So my three research questions were: what learning affordances offered by presupposed learning networks were perceived and taken up by the undergraduate STEM students? At this occasion, I was working with STEM environment, so my research students were coming from STEM disciplines. The second research question was what network learning practices are occurring within the presupposed learning networks? And the third research question is what are academic staff participants' perceptions of students' network learning practices within the presupposed learning network. So as you can see, I tried to have this holistical view, not only students, but students and the academic staff, which actually was relatively good strategy. You will see at the end. Because I was talking about the importance of theory, so my ontology was based on bio-ecological model of human development. That's Bronfenbrenner, but his latest work, Bronfenbrenner and Morris. That's the example which I included in my PhD. I tried to map Bronfenbrenner's model against the elements that I was investigating in my research, namely connected curriculum, formal learning networks, how I call them, informal personal learning networks, and network learning practices. So this is my ontology, the overall view of the learning and the learning processes. The second, there was, of course, there was epistemology. So I used at some stage and I reinterpreted the activity-centered analysis design framework, which was adapted from a work from Peter Goodyear and Lucila Carvalho, who is joining us today. And this shows how I see the process of how I understand the process of task design. Basically, the process of task design, learning task design, is based on the principle of indirect design. We cannot design experiences. We can only design the tasks, and then we see what will happen with the task design, how this task design will be enacted by students, taken up and enacted by students, and what will be the outcome. So as educators, we want our students to co-create, co-configure, to reconstruct knowledge, and then appropriate this knowledge or assimilate this knowledge, and then create something new, which will be the new knowledge. We do this through the task design, but actually the activity of doing what is happening with the task is the emerging activity. And this emergence is, that's the moment which is the most challenging for all of us, because we cannot predict in 100% what is going to happen, what will be the outcome. I'm sure you are familiar with this phenomenon. So this is one element of my epistemology. Second element of my epistemology was the model of affordance. I worked previously in my MPhil. I worked a lot on affordance, and I used the work from Good 2010. I also reappropriated the model of affordance to and redesigned a little bit the model. So how do I see affordance? Affordance is an opportunity for an action, which is nested within the functional context. And functional context is this trigger that's the environment, and triggers the perception and uptake of the affordance, of the opportunity. But functional context doesn't exist within the frame of reference. So this is this constant relationship between who I am, what the context, situational context, or functional context around me, and what is the affordance, the opportunity for an action, and how do I react, what do I do in this context situation. Next, finally, element of my epistemology was, of course, the notion of active learner, and how do I understand active learner? Because I'm very much influenced by educational psychology, I took the works of educational psychologists, Bjork, Danlowski, Cornell. They write a lot about active learner. So active learner in this perspective is a sophisticated and effective learner. So that's the learner who aims at achieving high level of self-regulation and self-direction. And I also put the information about self-regulated and self-directed learning. You know, there are other researchers who defined this concept in much more detail. But the model which I've got here, it just shows the interaction between self-regulation, which is on the top, and self-direction. So very often people are mixing a little bit or confusing self-regulation and self-direction. These are two different concepts. However, they do have some commonalities. And what is really important is this self-reflection of the student. Once again, we are going back to the problem: who I am, how do I react, how do I interact with the environment, how do I see an opportunity for learning, which for me as an educator is an important challenge, because I need to know how to design activities for my students to help them in perceiving these opportunities for learning. So very briefly, that's the research paradigm. I talked about ontology, epistemology, and the center of interests. The enabler, which enabled my my PhD to be done, it's the research methodology, and that was theory-seeking educational case study, and the operator was the research methods, mixed research methods. That means that I had 2 units, students and academic teaching teams involved into both units. For students, I conducted 135 respondents, 155 respondents I had to the survey, and I conducted 6 focus groups. For academic teaching teams, I had 8 respondents to the survey out of the 29, and 3 focus groups. For data analysis, I did the descriptive statistics and discourse analysis, just the standard procedures. So when I'm talking about learning networks, this is my presupposed architecture of learning networks. And you can ask me the question, why am I talking about presupposed? Initially, it wasn't the presupposed, but the excellent feedback from reviewers was that actually, to some extent, when we are looking at the learning networks, I assumed many elements in the learning networks when I designed my survey, which you will see in a moment. So then I was reflecting, and in my response to the examiners, I did agree that yes, I presupposed, that means I did in advance imagine certain elements of learning networks. So I did not discover these learning networks, but as an educator and as someone who has a quite long experience within the domain, I could predict some elements of the learning networks which were there. And this actually allowed me to see some ways of perceiving how I perceive the opportunities of learning and how my students perceive these opportunities for learning, which led me to some description of interference of perceptions. And I will talk about this a little bit later. So that's why I'm talking about the presupposed architecture. We all, to some extent, especially in educational system, we presuppose something. So these are constituting elements of my learning networks, and I tried to map them against the Lucila and Peter's structure. So we've got the section about ideas, then we have people, then we have tools, and finally we have artifacts produced by learners, and finally studying timetable, activities, etc. So these are practices of students that I looked at as well. Oops, something happened. Okay, I will go like that. All right. So this is just an you see, I don't know what happened. Yes, good. So this is an example, very brief example of descriptive statistical, which I've done with the surveys. Every single survey, every single question item had an affordance, which I identified affordance, so opportunity for an action provided by such and such a item, and I calculated median intercultural range and p significant at this something level. For the affordance, I also looked at the importance, intensity, but that's one of the examples. For other affordances, I also included frequency and sequence of the uptake. This very tedious work, I need to say that was quite tedious, but it allowed me to provide really very thorough classification, ranking of the affordances. I know that this is not based only on a number of respondents, but this is really very deep, thorough statistical analysis, which provided me with the ranking of affordances. Next step was in affordances to look at what do they actually afford for. So for example, when we have that's the lecture. Lecture affords for providing new content, learning directly from the lecturer, learning about assessment, meeting face-to-face with the lecturer. So you see, I just broke it down into discrete elements, and I wanted to see whether there was a difference between the units, and then you will see whether I also investigated whether there was a difference in perception and uptake of these affordances between students and the academic staff's perception. So this is one example of my statistical analysis, and this is an example of content analysis. Because I had open-ended questions in my survey, I did two types, deductive and inductive analysis. We've got an example of here. And after all of this, I came up to some conclusions and the findings. So I'm going to present very briefly the findings. So the findings to the first question, I think there are three findings with quite interesting conclusion at the end. So the first one is the learning affordances offered by formal learning networks were taken up in the first instance, followed by the affordances provided by informal learning networks. So you see, I think that there is some pattern or developmental pattern or gradation emerging from this, what I discovered. The second, affordances offered by social agents belonging to microsystem were taken up in the first instance, followed by those offered by the mesosystem and finally by exosystem. In other words, I am here and I will first connect with my colleagues who are closer to me, microsystem, then mesosystem, a little bit further away, and finally exosystem. Therefore, probably I'm not going to be connecting first in the first instance with someone who comes from organized institutional help. My first point of contact, if I need help, will be my close friend, my mate, my comrade, as I, that's the feeling of camaraderie in the classroom. And the further finding is the uptake of the online tools belonging to formal learning networks and requiring low level of autonomy was privileged over those requiring a high level of autonomy and belonging to informal learning networks. So we've got the formal learning network, something which I presuppose because it was designed to some extent by the institution, and informal learning networks. I don't have control over this because this is something that belongs to students. I cannot go to their places and to investigate what is happening in their places. So some elements of the learning design of learning networks, formal, they required low autonomy level. For example, if on a Blackboard site, I say directly, you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to use this and this software. This is low autonomy. So this type of learning networks or affordances were privileged by students. The more challenging, that means that more proactive attitude was required from students, the less they were uptaking these affordances, which allowed me to come to the conclusion that the decisive factor impacting on perception and uptake of affordances for learning was the required level of autonomy, not necessarily the type of intended interaction afforded by the tool. So in other words, I can have a tool which is very sophisticated, but if this sophisticated and excellent tool requires a lot of proactive attitude from students, from my study, it looks like the students are not going to privilege this. They will privilege something which is doesn't require such a proactive attitude. So that's the low level of autonomy. That's my first research question. Findings to the second research question. What I found in focus groups and talking to students is that very often they are using trial and error learning strategies, which means that they have low levels of awareness of self-regulated learning skills and self-directed learning skills. Very often they were saying, look, Iwona, I just succeeded in one unit, and I don't really think too much about how to learn in this unit. I just apply trial and error. If this strategy worked in this unit, I will apply the same strategy in another unit. Very often they were also confusing the success or effectiveness of the approaches. That's why I mentioned here the illusion of competence, because they were thinking, all right, I succeeded in this unit. That was a good strategy. So I'm going to use exactly the same strategy because it's effective. And that's this phenomenon of illusion of competence. So that's the discrepancy between predicted and actual memory performance. Which is quite dangerous actually for students, because if they can keep going like that, they risk to fall behind, because one day they will be in the unit which will require different learning strategies to be applied. And the same with the self-directing learning skills. That was quite interesting, because students were not really, that's what I said, they were not really interested in looking beyond the university. They were not looking beyond the microsystem or mesosystem. For example, when I asked the question about contacting professionals, especially now we have a pandemic situation, they should be looking around, looking for any available help. Many of them, they said that they never thought about contacting professionals. And there are many professional organizations or, open sources, for example, for IT students who might provide some advice when, for example, doing some problem-solving tasks. It very, very, very rarely occurred to students to go in this direction. So we are talking about self-directed learning skills, which draw me to the conclusion that combine both challenges provided evidence of respondents' difficulties with owning the learning networks. They were just using them, but they didn't take ownership of these learning networks. And finally, in response to my research question number 3, my first conclusion is the academics were moderately familiar with 3 aspects related to the students' academic identity and practices. So they knew fairly relatively well the students' frames of reference, but only those who were in close contacts with students. So, for example, tutors knew a little bit much more about students' background than the unit coordinators, which is normal. The uptake of learning affordances and students' network learning practices. So all of these 3 elements, they were familiar about this. They knew how students were going, in other words, but only to some extent. This may lead to the interference of perceptions. That's something which I suggested as a concept. That's the superposition of perceptions and that occur at the same time, some of which converge, some diverge, and combined they create a third perception. Let me show you what I mean by that, and then I will go back to the slide. So, for example, this is the analysis which I've done. That's the comparative analysis of uptake of the affordances provided by social agents, seen by staff and by students. And when you have a look at that, I color mapped this to see clearly. Some discrepancies were not so big. So, for example, for students, the ranking, fellow students enrolled in this unit as the people who they contact first were on the first position, while for staff, they thought that will be on the second position. Then in the first instance, students would contact QT teaching staff, so someone from the institution, while staff, of course, they thought now students will contact us first. Then when it comes to support staff, both of them, both of the cohorts, people and the students and the staff, they ranked the QT support staff at the third position. So this is the moment when they have exactly the same perception. In the first and the second, the differences were not so big. So this is slight difference, but not big. But let's have a look at the family member. Students ranked their family members at the fourth positions of people who they turn to for help when they have difficulties with learning, while staff, they rank them at the seventh position, which that's complete, that's quite a big difference, which suggests that because, of course, students have family members, they belong to the microsystem, to the closest environment, that's natural for them to turn to the family member provided the family member, of course, can provide the help with learning. While staff didn't even think about family members as a potential element to use in the design or to suggest to students in the design. The next element, as you can see, students from other universities and seen by students and staff, the difference is not so big. But when we have a look, for example, at the private tutors, students ranked the private tutors at the bottom. So it suggests that those students were not really asking private tutors for help, while staff thought that private tutors would be much more often consulted for help. So that's what I called this interference of perception. It's something which is up to discussion, of course, and I would be very grateful for any suggestions and any feedback. But I think there is something in there that this divergence, convergence, they are creating another perception, which might explain why sometimes academics or students are saying, yes, we agree on this point. So people tend to assume because I agreed at one point, everyone will agree with me on other points as well. And the second point, which I found in relation to the research question number 3, is academic staff's assumptions and the need of raising teaching awareness. So many academics were making a lot of assumptions. And without really having a background or evidence for backing what they were thinking, it is a little bit related to this interference of perceptions, because I think this is okay. Maybe I will assume that in other situations the students will act or will agree with me in other situations. And after my PhD, I keep reading, of course, I found quite interesting series of papers about so-called causal illusions in the classroom. And Double, he just published, he's from Oxford University, he just published quite interesting paper about this causal illusions in the classroom when they analyzed 6 different interventions. And the conclusion is that very often, academics are drawing conclusions based on students' performance. So this is this interference of perception. I see, all right, they performed well, they've done well. So my approach or my innovation is great. I'm teaching very good. So that's the second part of the research question to findings to research questions. So it drove me to, in a final conclusion, it drove me to suggest all these elements put together to suggest the ecological curriculum and learning design framework of connected epistemic domains. So I see ecology of the higher education as the system which is composed of 3 domains and systems of different experts and novices. So there's a domain of ideas, domain of design, and domain of practice. Domain of the ideas, basically, it is about epistemic fluency. These are all the experts, partners who are experts who are partners to the university who can provide very important information. They collaborate with domain of design. So that's the domain of epistemic design, which is composed of learning design team. And here I suggest that in a learning design team as an experts, and I'm talking about expertise in my PhD as well. What does it mean to be an expert? It's no time to explain this, but for learning design teams, I say that we've got on one hand academic teams who are the content experts, and on the other hand, we've got curriculum learning design teams who are educational experts. Because education, as all of you know, and I hope you will agree, this is the very specific level of expertise. So together, there are some elements of overlapping expertise between learning designers and the academics. Together, we can design for this indirect learning for emerging activity. So I'm talking about now last domain, that's the domain of practice, epistemic practice, where we have social practice, practice of settings. That's inspired by the Lucila's and Peter's framework. there is a designed task with emergent activity, and finally, hopefully, it will allow a student to become active lifelong learners, epistemically fluent, active lifelong learners. All right, I will finish here now at this stage. I do understand that you might have a lot of questions because, as I said, it's quite difficult to summarize 5 years of research and 400 pages in 30 minutes. And please ask me any questions, provide any comments if there is some elements which are not clear. And if you are interested, I just would like to invite you to go on QT ePrints and just download my work and read. Okay, so that's it from me. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Iwona. There's a lot to think about in there, and there was a little bit of discussion going on in the chat. We do have Henk, Huijser and Lucila Carvalho in as our guest expert special commentators, something. So I guess I'd like to call on them perhaps just to offer their thoughts as a starting point.
I posted my question in the chat, so well, one of my questions. I think it's just as you finish the model, it's just quite full of detail, right? I think one of the things that could be interesting for us as a group is to talk about if all those people are coming from the different perspectives and different backgrounds coming together, what would be then your suggestions in terms of how can we scaffold this design process, considering that people are bringing all these different perspectives together so that they are not sort of diverging, they're actually converging in terms of exchanging ideas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. This is an excellent question. Actually, I've been thinking about that. But you see, that's how the process of working together, the collaboration, starts. You know, we probably there is this concept of microcultures. So that's why I put in the center of my model the learning design team, which doesn't need to be big. They probably should be composed of a couple of people who are experts. You know, as an expert, I can understand and translate into less expertise like colleagues what my colleague experts are talking about. So for example, if I'm designing, I don't have a background in technology, but if I'm involved in a learning design for mathematics or for engineering, if by any chance I'm there as an educational expert, and I'm trying to learn as much about the discipline because skills are discipline related, but I can also try to reinterpret what my engineering colleagues are telling into the language of education. So I can apply this and help my academic colleagues to understand, all right, that's how we are going to do, because my expertise is in understanding the education, understanding the pedagogy, to break it down into tasks and to think, all right, how can I do this activity to help students in better learning? I will give you a concrete example. We've been talking recently about this, about the value of drill and kill activities in maths. Very often there is an opinion that drill and kill activity is not a useful approach to learning and teaching because it's just a drill and kill, yes?
Yeah.
Well, actually, there is an excellent book by Kirchner and Nielan, Hendricks, published this year. And one of the chapters of this book talks actually about this, the value of drill and kill, because it helps with cognitive load theory. So to answer to your question, I'm sorry it was a little bit long, but if I am on the team and I know the value of drill and kill, and I know that this is not bad activity actually, because it helps with cognitive load theory, then when we go to the problem-solving tasks, students don't need to go and scratch their heads, okay, so how do I do this? Because they already know this. You know, I can advise someone saying, look, this type of activities will be excellent in this moment, you know? And that's how I see this expertise. You know, what is expertise? Expertise is that I have a deep knowledge of my discipline, but I also start opening my mind towards other disciplines enough to translate. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the trick. Is how do you come together to have this shared understanding? And I think that's the core of the design essence, in a way, that is, it becomes not my idea or your idea, but it's actually our idea, because we are complementing each other with the different perspectives and views and ways of understanding the problem at hand. So
that's what we are talking when we are talking that the knowledge is learning is co-construction. That's what is happening. You know, we are creating, each time when we are creating something, we are creating the new knowledge, and then this new knowledge we need to feed it back to others who will take it up, and probably they will create the new knowledge.
yeah,
Very
good.
Any
I like the idea of translation, Iwona, you just mentioned, and I think it relates very directly to the role of TELedvisors, for example.
Exactly.
You know, we're kind of sitting somewhere in between. I was going to ask you what the role of evidence in all of this is, because when you talk about, for example, about illusions of competence, how, you know, between what a lecturer does, between what a learning designer, TELedvisor does, and what a student perceives, where does evidence come into this? Like, what is the best kind of way of approaching it that involves everyone? It's a difficult question.
Yes, and you know me, I will probably start breaking this down into parts. So certainly one of the elements of the evidence will be student achievement, not performance, but achievement. What did they achieve with this activity? If they have achieved what I designed that they should achieve, this is indication for me that yes, they are going in the good direction. So for example, if I want students to calculate something, and I understand the achievement is that they correctly calculated the strength of the material. Okay, so this is one piece of the evidence, but this is only one piece of the evidence. Another piece of the evidence will be really deep, thorough analysis of this, what is happening, you know, and that's, I think, I'm not talking about student evaluations of the teachers. I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about the type of work that I've done here. So we are taking the elements, we are analyzing, we are doing the statistical analysis to see whether there are differences. First of all, you know, one of the first questions when I was, that's a good example of working with another expert. I'm not an expert in statistics, so I had to talk to very skillful people and very wise people about statistics. And one of the first things that they told me was, Iwona, but you need to know whether you are talking about two different things. So how do you compare things? And that's the statistics. So going back to your question, this is this deep analysis which we probably should be doing, because this is only in my opinion, this is the moment when we can say, all right, on the surface, they achieved something, but what really happened in the background, deep in the situation. So we will know that we are basing our opinion on the evidence is based on a deep analysis and not only on a surface analysis, on quick perceptions of students. That was good, they performed, because this is very short link to, for example, slippery design of the assessment. You know, if I design assessment only on student performance and only based on student satisfaction rates, you know, I might be in trouble with student knowledge, you know. So this is the second element of analysis. Another element of analysis of evidence will be probably how students are performing once they finish the study. This is also important. Whether they are able actually to go and to apply the knowledge, finish the unit, for example, and how they are performing in another unit. What do they do in another unit? Do they make this connection? I hear very often my colleagues, academics, they are saying, but they already forgot about everything. Well, maybe, it depends how do you understand learning. Well, for me, learning is to retrieve from your long-term memory the information which is there. So what are the techniques that you are using to help them in retrieving from long-term memory the information and then applying this information in new context? Maybe they didn't forget all of this. Maybe just they need a strategy to retrieve from long-term memory and then to apply this in the new context. I don't know. So that's another element to have a look. And
just on that, Iwona, as Cheryl asked the question earlier, which was whether this was more about metacognition than learning skills.
Yes.
And I guess to me, there's that barrier, there's that connection between it. Metacog is much bigger than just learning, but a lot of the approaches to learning and things like that we're teaching could, not always, but could fall under that metacog category, that development of metacognition.
And what was really interesting for me when I asked students explicitly, do you think that you would like to be taught explicitly learning strategies? Many of them, they said yes, because that's, that followed directly from the, Iwona, we are just using trial and error. I was successful here, so I think I will be successful in the next unit, etc. So I don't know. I can see the value of direct teaching them about learning strategies. And when I'm talking about learning strategies, they need to realize that, for example, highlighting is not a very useful learning strategy, or rereading the text, it's not very useful learning strategy. They don't know it. How could they know it?
There was a really interesting study out of UQ about they did intentionally teach some of these learning strategies, and they didn't find any improvement in their students. But in the paper, they never explicitly commented on which cohort of students they were teaching. And to get into the program that this person taught into at UQ, you needed an OP1. So that piece of information was never presented in the paper, and I think it's really relevant because if you've already got a student, the highest ATAR you can get, 99 or something, and so these are quite intelligent students who have already learned how to successfully pass tests. The benefit or the gain that they could get in learning new strategies, is it there versus student who is middle of the range? And it was really interesting that it wasn't even addressed at all in the paper, but based on knowledge I had, I was able to find that information out by looking at course codes and things. And so I think we need to sometimes consider who our students are.
Yes, well, that's what I'm saying. Yes, you need to know your students. That's one of the conclusions that I said. You need to know your students and realize a little bit better their frame of reference. But also, going back to this point about high achieving students, yes, they probably already have a good learning strategies, but there is never too late to learn something new. And when I'm saying that we probably could or should consider explicitly teaching learning strategies, I'm not saying that this must be like that. It should be embedded. So it should be paired with the very efficient teaching strategies. So for example, you've got interleaved practice. You've got all the retrieval practice teaching techniques which are there. So if these techniques are paired with explicitly explaining to students, you are doing this task and we are asking you to do this task because you will understand or remember better, or something like that. You know, we are upfront with students, and they understand that they need to do this task in this way because there is a reason in this. I suspect they will take up and they will follow us. But of course, there will be always, you know, this is the science of learning. We have so many variables here. And in education, you know, sometimes I always remember this young academic from mathematics who told me, you know, Iwona, education is wishy-washy. Yes, it is. It is. It is, because we have so many variables, so many people, so many elements. One day you have a very good class, and then the same day in the afternoon, the same class, the same topic, something goes wrong, and you know, the class is completely different. So I'm not saying categorically that's what we need to do, but I'm saying there is strong evidence from research that we should know better our students, that we should look better at the teaching techniques, we should look better at the learning strategies. And because expertise, you know, we cannot be experts in everything, my suggestion is let's collaborate, work together with experts in education who will be able to apply the expertise and translate the content into some meaningful activities, educational activities in the context. Because, you know, when I read Lina Markauskaitė's work, it's so obvious that the next challenge will be to teach our students to be epistemically fluent. And this is the understanding, being able to understand other people's expertise and try to overlap a little bit to the extent of being able to collaborate. Does it make sense?
Yes, I think it returns to the point that we were talking before, isn't it? Because we were talking in the context of design, but it's also in the context of the students in general, right? As they enter different professions and different places, everybody actually needs this skill of being able to navigate different ways of knowing and different, you know, recognize different types of knowledge and seeing the value in the difference, right? And that's the perspective of networked learning, which recognizes the value of the difference. And it's actually through the difference that you can actually, you know, learn more and enrich like an environment. But on the point of what you were talking about, one of the things that I was saying is that it's also a design question. It's also about measuring how much do you scaffold things for your students and how much you actually allow them to discover by themselves. So this is the crucial teaching, you know, conundrum, if you want. You don't want people to be lost, but you don't want to give everything.
Yes, and as you know, the scaffolding in theory should be, you know, heavy at the beginning, and then we should remove the scaffolding to the extent that at the end they are autonomous and they are independent. And there is always this problem where they are autonomous and independent. Just on that point of the scaffolding, I see very strong value in direct instruction. I think there is a place for direct instruction. Once again, at some stage in education, direct instruction didn't have a very good press as to prescriptive and not allowing discovery. But, you know, discovery, once again, that's the cognitive load theory. Discovery can be made only when I know something, and then I can discover something. So once again, we are going back to the same problem, maybe working with an expert who will be able to suggest maybe this is the moment when they already know enough, so their cognitive load shouldn't be so big in discovering, and now they should focus shift the focus on discovering the problem and start enjoying the process of discovering the problem without going back to the basics. So that's the example that I gave about the drill and kill. That's the same in language. You know, my primary education is in language teaching, and yes, we do drill and kill very often. to practice the grammar structure, to not to be worried, how am I going to construct this sentence? That's another example.
Iwona, I think that's why it's so important to, in terms of design, to think about this on the level of a whole program, you know, over a
Yes.
period of time, rather than, and in reality, what we often struggle with is that we work on individual units of study, like individual courses, rather than programs. And I think that's part of the issue. Because, you know, like I really like the idea of the concept of a learning ecology that allows for all these affordances, but one particular unit is not enough to teach students how to leverage that. You know,
No,
it's a process that
yes,
takes place over time. So yeah.
But the unit is never, you know, a lone, lonely atom, you know, floating somewhere. It's always the part of the whole structure, you know. So I do agree with you to some extent. We do have very good structures when we do the curriculum design, when we are doing the curriculum mapping. This is the point when we can sit down and have a look. All right, not only on at the level of TEXA requirements, you know, which skills, etc., but also maybe that might be a moment to include or reflect on learning strategies and how we are going to do it, because, you know, this is the problem. How you are going to help your students to achieve this? That's the problem. And, you know, so, as I said, that's the science of learning, and that's the beauty of education, you know.
Colin just asked how we encourage more program course level learning design then, which is an excellent question. We've been trying something called a curriculum design studio model at QT, which has varying levels of success or not, depending on how you look at it. But the idea is there to bring together curriculum designers, learning designers, and course coordinators to approach the whole process of program design from different angles with different levels of expertise involved. And it includes educational technologists as well. So, and the idea is that you kind of tie it or align it with cycles of accreditation, so that you kind of start from, you know, so that you're looking at overall program design and then feed in expertise as you go along. So that's a model, but it's hard to kind of do that in a structural way.
Yes, and you see, I think we will have to go in more and more into such a model of this microcultures composed of a couple of experts who are working together, because we can see the unbundling or dismantling of higher education institutions, yes? So we see more and more discrete elements. We are talking now about micro-credentials. So it looks like there will be big changes coming.
But also, I was just thinking, if you think about your structure when you talked about the macro, meso, and the micro, right? Like if we're talking about curriculum redesign across, you know, across different units, then you are having to have support from management, right? For all those people to get together as well. And everybody, I don't know in your university, but in mine, everybody is kind of like up to here with work. So it really needs to have, it really shows how the different dimensions come into play to interfere in what is actually happening at the classroom with, you know, the teacher and the students as well. And if you don't have that support and that value that comes from the management, those types of changes don't actually happen.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Well, I really don't know how to comment on that point.
There's some challenges, yes. So we
Oh, sorry.
We are coming towards the end of the session. I just wanted to make sure that, or to see whether there was anyone in the wider community, if they had any particular questions I'd like to bring up, or comments or thoughts. Just open the discussion a little bit in the last few minutes. I guess they probably would have been chatting and posting those questions as we're going. But yeah, if anyone posted something that they particularly feel like they'd like to comment on, now is your opportunity. Otherwise, yeah, I guess maybe just some closing thoughts from everyone.
Lucila, Henk?
I was going to ask, well, thank you, first of all, Iwona, that was really good. I was going to ask you where you're going to take this next. Like, how do you see this develop?
Well, I would like to focus on basically on the problem of these two illusions of competence from students and causal illusions from teaching staff, but in the context of changing environment. That means that we need to it's almost like a double activity. On one hand, we should have a look a little bit much more on professional development for academic staff. On the other hand, learning design. So that's this side of the story. But what is really interesting for me on a larger point is to see how we can help students in understanding and working together in cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary teams. So this is this element of epistemic fluency. How do we make sure that they understand each other? Because that's the constantly feedback which we hear from many people who are in the industry. We hear them saying, but students don't know how to work with us. I suspect it's not that they don't know how to work with them. It's just they don't understand many elements because they don't know how to deconstruct these elements of the knowledge. And what are the strategies to ask for guidance from their colleagues in the workplace? So that's the, yes, academic teaching development, learning design combined with this epistemic fluency, probably.
That's fantastic. I think that really actually, sorry. I think that really, after you.
No, I finished.
I was just going to say, I think that actually encapsulates a lot of what the TELedvisors community is about. We are very much about bringing these disparate sort of areas of knowledge and experience and using them much more effectively in the sector than we're currently doing. So we're at time. So I think that was a fantastic discussion and it was great to see your work. So many thanks, Iwona. Thanks also, Lucila and Henk, for your contributions, and basically everyone. I think we've had a really rich discussion, and I think that this is something that we'll absolutely continue talking about in the future. So if everyone just show their appreciation again in the chat, and we'll wrap it up.
Congratulations, Iwona.
Thank you everyone for hosting me and spending this hour listening to me.